Welcome, everybody. Happy Thursday, September 28th. Welcome, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here today. Nearly 500 people are tuning in with us this early afternoon on the East Coast, morning on the West Coast, later in the afternoon and evening. We are here to launch Advancing Racial Equity Through Technology Policy, a new report informed by original research from scholars including Dr. Veena Dubal, Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Dr. Sarah Myers West, Dr. Ruha Benjamin and Sierra Robson, Dr. Fallon Wilson, Dr. Jasmine McNeely, Dr. Ulysses Mejias, May Watson Grote, and Amina Kirk, and Dr. Shelley Stewart. The project was also informed and guided by our advisory committee, Becky Chow, Dr. Sasha Costanza-Chalk, Lisa Dyer, Dr. Dominique Harrison, Ryan Garrity, Dr. Tina Park, Dr. Andre Perry, Stephen Renderos, Solana Rice, Brittany Smith, and Adrian Williams, who provided deep subject matter expertise across a variety of domains. This project would not have been possible without all of these people, and so I just want to extend a really big thank you. I also want to thank my co-authors, Sarah Truhaft, Rachel Gashinga, and especially Eliza McCullough, who has worked closely with me on this project from start to finish. Our mission for this project was to provide a novel framing and holistic picture of the big tech business model and how it works distinctly, provide evidence for the ways this exacerbates injustice, and a roadmap for intervention to shift power towards people and communities of color who are most often marginalized and harmed. I couldn't have asked for better timing for this report to launch. The AI policy conversation is accelerating in the US quickly with the reintroduction of the AI Accountability Act and Senator Schumer's roundtables on AI. This past Tuesday, the FTC sued Amazon for, quote, interlocking anti-competitive and unfair strategies to illegally maintain its monopoly power, the dynamics of which and how they impact marginalized communities you can learn more about in the report. The Leadership Conference has just recently launched their new Center on Civil Rights and Technology. AI Now launched yesterday a new report on computational power, and so much more. The AI Bill of Rights is a fantastic example of centering racial equity in technology policy, both in the framing and recommendations, but the mainstream conversation is still dominated with false binaries like we can't have meaningful regulation and innovation, that geopolitical competitiveness is at odds with mitigating harms from AI systems, that AI is either going to be the best thing that ever happened or is going to kill us all. In reality, much of this rhetoric intentionally and conveniently distracts the public and policymakers from the fact that the largest tech firms have an outsized impact on our democracy and economy, and it is their business model that sets them apart and allows them to continuously consolidate power, which in turn leads to the replication and amplification of racialized harm. As Dr. Timnit Gebru said recently in a Fast Company article, wherever we are is not inevitable. We do not have to cede the future to big tech. A regulatory agenda that centers racial equity will not only build a better tech sector, but also a more just economy and society in which everyone has access to the resources they need to thrive. While exclusion and racialized harms come at great cost, inclusion and equity brings cascading benefits for us all. To discuss this more, we are joined by an exceptional group of panelists, experts, and all-around wonderful humans. Stephen Renderos is Executive Director of Media Justice, a national racial justice organization that advances the media and technology rights of people of color. For the past decade, Stephen has led campaigns at Media Justice that lowered the cost of prison phone calls, secured net neutrality rules, and got Donald Trump kicked off Twitter. And we were so fortunate to have Stephen serve on the advisory committee for this project. Dr. Veena Dubal, professor of law, University of California, Irvine, and author of Technology, Fishering, and Race for this project. Her research focuses on the intersection of law, technology, and precarious work. Dr. Sarah Myers-West, Managing Director of AI Now Institute, authored Antitrust, Labor, and Racial Equity for this project, and her award-winning research and writing blends social science, policy, and history to address the intersection of technology, labor, and accountability. And Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution, the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation and co-editor-in-chief of Tech Tank, who authored It's Time for an Updated Civil Rights Regime Over Big Tech for this project. Nicole researches public policy designed to enable equitable access to technology across the US and to harness its power to create change in communities around the world. Unfortunately, Nicole couldn't be with us today, but has some recorded remarks to kick off our conversation.
Well, hello there. I am so sorry that I am not with you today. I am Dr. Nicole Turner Lee, Senior Fellow in Governance Studies and the Director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. I was honored when I was asked to participate in this project for a couple of reasons. We're seeing big tech technology do things that we've never seen before when it comes to the transformative capacities of technology that has essentially transformed every aspect of our lives. I've got a forthcoming book on this. It's entitled Digitally Invisible: How the Internet is Creating the New Underclass. And it essentially looks at this conflation between race, place, and space, and how this transition from an analog to more digital society is actually creating some vulnerabilities when we think about people's human and civil rights. As part of my paper, one of the things that I want to continue to highlight is just as we've seen the efficiencies in new technologies, we have to be wary of any type of potential violation or infraction on civil rights that people have fought very long for. Rosa Parks sat on that bus for a reason, as did other leaders, to make way and space for the voices of the underrepresented. As we have this conversation today, it is imperative that we continue to question, interrogate, debate the fluency of our civil rights statutes and laws as they apply to this new economy. My friend Adam Thierer commonly talked about, when I was first researching this space many, many years ago, around this idea of permissionless innovation. And we've seen permissionless innovation come out with an unapologetic stance on the power of technology in our society. But permissionless innovation should not come with permissionless forgiveness, nor should append any of the structural considerations that make inalienable rights for people to ensure that they have equal access and opportunities to employment and healthcare and education and voting. Things like misinformation are real, folks, and they actually become harder to disentangle in a more opaque internet. And as we see artificial intelligence tools permeate our society and make those systems even more opaque, it's going to be important for us to actually interrogate and to explore the fluency again of those civil rights laws. I'm so sorry that I cannot be here because this is the right time for us to be having this conversation. Between the National Blueprint on the AI Bill of Rights to what we're actually seeing at technical agencies like NIST in terms of a risk management framework, to how we're trying to develop more inclusive research systems when it comes to artificial intelligence in particular, there's no better time to ensure that diversity, equity, and inclusion are at the table in these conversations, and that the people who are impacted by more inclusive policymaking are equally represented. I recently heard this conversation, and I'll share this before I close with some ideas on how to jumpstart this conversation. If you know me, I am honestly there, even though I'm not there in person. A woman on a show I was watching on NPR suggested that people with lived experiences tend to be closer to the trauma, and that's why they need to be included. As we deal with traumatized data sets, as my friend Renee Cummings always talked about from the UVA data science department, to interrogating potentially regulation, guidance, and oversight that will help us build more equitable AI, I just implore us to think about the role that big tech is playing in society and ensure that they are legally compliant with those statutes. Friends, we need a platform for equitable AI and equitable technology, participative models and methodologies, and most importantly, we need a values framework, something that I talk about in my paper for this project. So thank you for having me. Again, I am so sorry I'm not there in person. I look forward to being part of continuing conversations in this space. And again, have a great rest of the conference and discussion.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Nicole. You're definitely here in spirit, if not in IRL. And so with that, just building on what Nicole was talking about, Stephen, I wonder if we could start with you. Can you talk a bit about media justice and how you think about the impact of the big tech business model on the lives of people of color, your core constituency?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Julia. I mean, for starters, let me just say thank you for having me, alongside all these other wonderful folks on this panel. And also a special thank you to you, Julia, for all the work you've done to pull this report together. I know it's been a huge labor of love and so many hands that have contributed towards it, and really exciting to see it come out. If you're unfamiliar with media justice, we're a national organization that works to advance a liberatory vision for media and technology. That vision is one where everyone is connected, represented, and free. We believe that in order to get to that future we seek, people of color have to be at the center of shaping and controlling the role that media and technology play in our society. Our work is oriented towards growing the leadership and capacity of people of color to fight to address the media and tech issues that are most affecting their lives. So as I think about, your question, Julia, I think about the phrase big tech, and which in and of itself already takes as a given that there are a handful of corporations who have been very successful in a business and profit sense of dominating this industry. Some of these companies are even seen as like blue chip stocks on Wall Street, compared to the likes of Coca-Cola and Home Depot. The leaders of these companies have enjoyed like a pretty sizable veneration through media, which builds these narratives of tech bros as some kind of wonderkins. And I think what it all hides is the extraction, the exploitation, the marginalization that all of that wealth is built upon. And largely, this is because technology is being built to be sold. It's being built by big tech to make profit for their shareholders. And because big tech operates within and benefits from the confines of racial capitalism, then the technologies that it actually produces follows its mandates of reinforcing the power structures that are marginalizing people of color. So to kind of break that down and give you a quick example from our work, last year we were asked to support one of our partner groups in Urbana, Illinois, that was trying to stop the purchase of an automatic license plate reader that the city council was considering. And if you're unfamiliar with those devices, it's a device that allows police departments to continuously scan license plates without needing to like manually input information and search for tickets and warrants, and just do this on a consistent basis. Um, the city council, kind of in response to wanting to address public safety, considered purchasing these devices, and the locations where the devices would be placed were all going to be predominantly Black neighborhoods in Urbana. Now, Urbana is a small town, but in the confines of that small town, they were focusing on the Black neighborhoods for the site to place these kinds of technologies in. So here you have a technology that's being bought by a city for its police department that would have been deployed in a Black neighborhood. Thankfully, our members there were able to fight back and stop the purchase of that technology. But this is a common story that reoccurs in communities throughout the United States. And the point is that when it comes to the big tech business model, I think about who the business is for, who the technologies it produces are for, who benefits from these technologies. And by and large, the answers to those questions do not include people of color, and do not include people who hold any sort of marginalized identity, whether that's along the lines of race, gender, sexuality, and disability. Um, it's like what a mentor of mine actually used to tell me. He said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And when it comes to the table that is big tech, we are not on the table. We're not at the table, but we definitely are on the menu. And whether that's like through the use of AI to make decisions that get in the way of a single mom being able to access her unemployment benefits, or a person being able to access work, or the ability of someone to walk freely in their community without being watched, all of those things are at play. So, I think a lot about what Dr. Nicole Turner Lee was talking about the underclass that's being created by the success of big tech. And among that underclass are people of color, at the very core of who's being exploited, of whose data is being collected, of who these technologies are being used against, of whose power is being diminished. So those are some of the things that come to mind for me there.
Thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about right off the bat, Stephen, and I wonder, Sarah, if you might pick up from there, and talk a bit about, from your perspective, your research has often really looked at the business model and how it operates, and if you want to build on what Stephen's shared, that would be great.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Stephen just gave such a crisp and crystallized view into the extractive business model that's at the heart of the tech industry. And I think he pulled out two particular dynamics, that it sort of operates on the premises of extraction and of ownership. So maybe what I can just sort of delve into what that looks like materially a little bit more, and how that impacts communities of color in particular. So when you talk about what you need to build like artificial intelligence systems, or many of the systems on which the tech industry makes profit, they're very reliant on resources, including data, including labor, which I'm sure Dr. Dubal will be getting into in more depth as well, and then also ownership of the infrastructure on which much of our economy at large, I won't even say digital economy because it sort of is now so pervasive, relies. And so when you look under the hood at each of those components, there are a number of different dimensions through which this business model sort of reflects back historical patterns of structural racism, of racial capitalism, and in many ways ramps it up. So if you look at data, for example, the tech industry's business model is heavily premised on the collection of data through consumer surveillance practices, through increasingly invasive surveillance into the most intimate corners of our lives. This surveillance practices, I think, as Stephen has already pointed out, often target communities of color in particular. The use of the data as you build larger and larger AI models drawn from the data, because AI is premised on looking for patterns, it is inherently going to reflect back and ramp up historical patterns of inequality. So the entire sort of like data practice of big tech firms, you see an amplification of structural racism. Now, in order to make the data intelligible or meaningful, there's an incredible amount of labor that is involved in the process, labor that is often underpaid, undervalued, and increasingly under threat, even as it is absolutely essential work that workers are engaged in when they are going through and labeling training data sets, or when they are, teaching an AI model, what responses look more or less like something that a human generated. Similarly, if you look at the emergence of platform-based work, again, the same patterns of extractivism, of increasingly invasive data mining in order to reassert control over workers. And then lastly, talking about infrastructure, the infrastructures that are needed to build large AI models, the infrastructures on which the tech industry relies, they are very material. The cloud is a metaphor that evokes, something that's invisible, that's kind of ephemeral, almost like cute. But the reality is that these are data centers. They're data centers that exist in communities. They're often built in places where, building data centers requires a tremendous amount of water resources, a tremendous amount of energy. They're often positioned in parts of the country and around the world in places where the communities are already water strained and they're drawing on public aquifers, for example. The chips that go into those data centers require the use of incredibly hazardous chemicals. It's extremely toxic to build, to build the chips needed for data centers, and that toxicity actually increases as chips grow smaller in size. And that's been a really important front for worker organizing, both now and also historically. So I guess what I'm saying is, across many sort of like parallel layers of the business model, you see this dual nature of extractivism and an ownership that doubles back and reinforces patterns of inequality that harm communities of color much worse. And then the tech itself similarly, affects people's access to resources, their life chances, that reinforce historical patterns of racism.
Thanks, Sarah. And you teed up Dr. Dubal very nicely in terms of really diving in on the role of labor. Invisibilized labor is a component of the business model that we really hone in on. And so, I think that the practices of labor extraction to benefit management at the expense of workers is nothing new. And so I'd love for you to talk a little bit about how these dynamics show up differently and are distinct in the context of big tech.
Yes, so I'll start just by saying that I'm really grateful to be in conversation with you all, and I'm particularly grateful for this report, which as you laid out at the beginning, really builds on the work of just pioneering thinkers and distills a lot of that research in a way that's understandable, clear, and sets forth a path that we can follow from a policy, from an organizing perspective, to build more equitable worlds. So thank you very much. Stephen started to talk a little bit about racial capitalism, and I guess I'll start there. So racial capitalism has become sort of a buzzword in the academy. And if I could just distill it very, very simply, it's this idea that racialized exploitation and capital accumulation are interlinked and mutually enforcing. We see this very, very clearly in the tech economy. So all of the things that we love and enjoy, all of the things that we hate, from the Zoom that we're on to the military defense products that we protest, to the platforms that we work through and on, that we chat with each other on, all of this is built fundamentally on the labor of individuals. It's not magic. It doesn't happen. When the tech overlords snap their fingers. It's really built on the labor of millions of people that are dispersed all over the world. Much of this labor is invisible. And most of the people that are doing the hardest, most time-consuming work are underpaid. They're from the global South, and they're people of color. Again, recreating, re-entrenching existing, really untoward and racist structures that capital has been built on over the last 200 years. So I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about some of what is highlighted in this report, which is how the invisibility of this labor contributes to racialized exploitation and dispossession and inequality. Two ways in which labor is invisible. actually multiple ways. I'll start with one way in which labor is invisible is through the process of fissuring. So something that economist David Weil named, but a process that we've seen sort of all over the world is this trend of firms, core firms, is to pretend like they only are employing the folks who work on what is their core competency. So a tech firm might say, well, we only actually employ our managers and our engineers, and everyone else, people are working on temporary projects, people who are doing data cleaning, et cetera. All these people are actually not our employees. They are either subcontractors, they work for someone else, or they are independent entrepreneurs. So in this process, that we've seen across sectors, in the tech sector, it is extreme. So Google, for example, we know that there are that the majority of what we might consider their workforce is actually not formally employed by the company. And the people that are formally employed by the company that do get the benefits of being on the inside, whose labor is acknowledged as being, they're acknowledged as Googlers, these people are predominantly white and they are predominantly male. So that's one way in which labor is made invisible and inequality is reproduced and entrenched. On the other end of the economic scale, we're talking about, again, data workers, we're talking about service workers who are deployed by technologies, we're talking even about engineers who are doing piecework. And these folks, again, many of them in the majority world, most of them, people of color, underpaid. And their labor is not only physically invisible, but actually they are only paid for some of their labor. So tech has also reintroduced piecework. So the vast majority of the time, maybe 60% of the time that they spend working is formally invisible, in so much as they are not being remunerated for that. Again, recreating economic inequalities. The last way in which I'll talk about that big tech has really invisibilized labor is through extraordinary and extreme surveillance that we have never witnessed before in the history of modern capitalism. And what this extreme and extraordinary surveillance does is makes workers' concerns, ironically, right, makes workers' concerns, makes workers, endangers workers' health and safety, and makes all of these things sort of invisible, in so much as workers don't have the ability to collectivize and make demands for better workplaces. And so they're sort of, the harms that they experience every day are also made invisible. And so I guess I'll just end by going back to what I started by saying that all of these processes of labor invisibility lend themselves not just to precarity, to like real psychological precarity and real economic precarity, but they lend themselves to structures of racialized dispossession. So we're talking about some people benefiting from the products produced by big tech. We're talking about other people who are building those products, and what emerges is sort of it is a dangerous analogy, but I think it has to be said, sort of a plantation, a global plantation of workers, plantation owners and holders. Many of the people at the bottom are actually working in conditions of extraordinary exploitation. And again, this dynamic becomes very racialized. So part of what's so important about this report is that it tries to make this dynamic seen, and to address it in a meaningful way.
Thank you so much, Veena, and to all of you. And I think that one of the sort of things that's emerging is that you all touched on, and that is so often sort of implied, if at all present, is just how people are at the center of all of these concerns. And I think so often the tech policy conversation is framed in terms that are not really human at all, and don't speak to the points of entry are not around how are humans being harmed, how are communities being extracted from, or losing water access because of data centers that were placed there, but rather framed in sort of these technocratic or kind of distancing frames. And so I'm just sort of curious, what would it look like to build a broader ecosystem that includes organizations and communities outside of the traditional contours of tech policy? And what's the bridge that needs to be built so that, you know, as the tech policy conversation and the AI policy conversation is accelerating, especially in DC, you know, that we really are seeing the concerns of everyday people at the table, and that policymakers understand how to translate how things are being framed by industry into the issues of their constituents. Maybe I'll start with you, Stephen, and then I really would love to open it up. Let's just, you know, throw the formal, you know, popcorn out and build on each other's thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. I'll see if I can tee it up for other folks to jump in. But I mean, some of what I think about this question a lot, especially because, you know, I may look relatively young, but I've actually been in this field of kind of media advocacy and tech advocacy for now, you know, coming on 15 years. I was reflecting on earlier this week. I've seen this field really grow, you know, from a time where the internet was this place of possibility, where, you know, it hadn't yet become the cesspool of disinformation and you know, and helping cohere white nationalism in the United States. It hadn't yet become that. You know, it was still like my blog can make a huge difference in the world. And seeing it completely change, but also seeing the field change and grow, that's been wonderful. But it's also made me realize how much we still lack in terms of being able to take these technology issues that for a lot of communities that we work with are seen as secondary fights. How do we cross the bridge to help them understand and align around these issues as being primary fights? Because of the rise of big tech, because of the proliferation of technology in our society, they have continued to become that. It has become a primary fight. So I think, you know, my thinking has always been about trying to meet communities where they're at, and particularly thinking about uh, where the conditions are bubbling up on the ground. And I think Sarah went into a really good example of something I've been thinking a lot about, is like the construction of these server farms that are occupying physical space in our communities, that are extracting actual resources. And that's a place where a lot of people in our communities are already agitated and organized around climate and around environmental justice, and are thinking about those issues. And here's an intersecting fight where it makes a big difference. In our work, one place where we've decided to go towards, because it has been a place where people are already kind of thinking about these issues, but have no clear analysis or a clear intervention to drive, has been in the space of the proliferation of technology in the criminal legal system, whether that's around the use of risk assessment tools, or the use of electronic monitoring. And that's been important because many of the communities that we care about are folks that are driving other social movements, like folks leading, you know, abolitionist work to try to end the construction of jails, or trying to end terrible practices around cash bail that keep people incarcerated. But that's a place where we've seen the integration of technology essentially replacing the gains that movements have made around decarcerating. You know, for the better part of the last 10 years, we've been on a downward trend around mass incarceration. So the prison population in the United States has steadily gone down, but at the same time, we've seen the rise of the use of ankle bracelets and other kind of forms of electronic monitoring. And so, you know, meeting communities where they're at, recognizing that this is a condition that they're now having to contend with. How do we support them in being able to develop the right analysis and identify the solutions that they can drive in their communities? And that's been kind of the big focus of our work there. The other thing I would say is, like, us in our sector, knowing how to take advantage of the opportunities that are emerging in this moment. Obviously, this has been a very active week when it comes to like tech and tech regulation in particular. But but I think about the writer's strike and what's been going on over the last few weeks and actually months, and the way that AI was a central player in that fight, in that labor fight, and it offered a really unique opportunity to kind of bring new people into the fold and thinking about these issues in a new way. So that's the other thing I guess I would say is paying attention to where there is kind of organic emerging power that's building, and the writer strike, because workers are coalescing, felt like it was a really good opportunity to kind of move towards that, and to integrate the issues that we work on, that are fighting on, to imbue kind of our perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, just to underscore the point that Stephen just made, I mean, so much of what we know about the way that AI and other tech systems are being deployed in the world is the product of organizing by workers. It's the product of community organizing. So many of the wins that we've been able to gain are not coming through like tech policy battles. It's coming through community-based work and worker-led organizing. And so, I would almost take your question, Julia, and say that's kind of an imperative right now, because if we're in an environment where the conclusion that's being arrived on so often by people who are in positions of power is we need to deploy AI as the solution to every problem that comes across our desk. And AI it's a resource intensive technology. It's expensive. Like, those are dollars that could be put elsewhere. Winding back that question to, really ask, what's the problem that we're trying to solve for here, and really, is AI the right solution to this problem? I think when you start to do that, the real function that AI systems are often serving is to justify austerity measures. One, to like devalue work, devalue devalue like people, or to exacerbate power and information asymmetries, to increase the control of people who are in positions of power and over those who are comparatively in positions of less power. And that makes, labor policy, environmental justice, economic justice, like these concerns are really the front lines of this fight.
I just want to add, I think, on the labor end of things, specifically, over the last 5 years, there's been a lot of discussion about rehauling labor law, attempts by the Biden administration to pass the PRO Act, which would really have empowered a lot of workers, including a lot of tech workers, to unionize, and just generally a sense that U.S. labor law is behind the times, specifically behind where we are with regard to how dispersed and atomized workers are in a tech economy. But I would just underscore something that Stephen said, which is that while all of that is true, it doesn't necessarily undermine the possibilities of wide-scale collective action. That is to say that labor law does not have to shift before tech workers are supported in their organizing efforts. And so, the WGA contract, which we all know really went very far, quite far, much further than anyone thought would be possible in redlining the use of generative AI in Hollywood. I mean, this is an amazing, incredible, should be celebrated. Like, I want to scream it from the roofs example of what Sarah said, which is that we don't have to deploy everything that we can possibly create. That if we reimagine our approach to innovation such that we are thinking about meeting people's basic needs, fighting hunger, stopping climate change, doing all of these things that are really about flourishing, using tech to those ends, then we might be and can be in a very different place. And so while I am very excited about the FTC's lawsuit against Amazon, and I think it's very promising. I hope to see a lot more of that in the future. I hope to see a lot more of an approach to competition policy that puts more power in the hands of small business owners, of individuals, and not just in the concentrated hands of the few sort of tech billionaires who, from what we can all tell, are just like megalomaniacal and don't have our interests at heart. I think that is like super important and very excited to see it. I want to just to repeat, as Stephen and Sarah said, that so much power is in the people. So much power is in our own ability to name our harms, to organize around them, and to push for the futures that we imagine. And I really hope that people look carefully at what the WGA did. And this, what was it, 176-day strike of, like, strikes are fun for a lot of people, but they're also really involve both bravery and precarity. You don't know whether you're going to be able to pay for rent. It's a huge sacrifice, and those collective sacrifices brought amazing outcomes, and we can do a lot more of that.
If I could just pick up on that point that Veena just made, because I think it's a really good point about just that what was actually won is a group of people saying, here's a place where we are drawing the line and saying, no, AI should not be utilized. And I think about how incredibly profoundly important that is. I think back to a few years ago when the integration of facial recognition technology by police departments was happening all over the country. I remember at the time, at the federal level, there were conversations about, well, we gotta mobilize quickly to get a piece of legislation in the books that regulates how to use the technology. And a lot of wonderful people, including good friends of mine, were like behind that push for regulation, because that is the thing you do. How do we reduce the potential for harm through policy? And there were groups across the country and communities who were saying, actually, no, the application of this technology within the context of a racist policing system is not worth it at all. And there's no way that you can regulate the harm out of the system. And I think about groups, and so we were part of the efforts in San Francisco that actually passed the first city's facial recognition ban, and multiple other cities followed suit. But some of that work had actually been built on learning from groups like one of our members in Los Angeles, the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, who has taken this very strong a strong stance of preventing the integration of technologies within policing. And their work at the very front lines has prevented the Los Angeles Police Department, one of the biggest police departments in the country, from adopting the use of drones, from shutting down its predictive policing program because of research that they had done. And sometimes I think the ability to kind of slow the pace down, because technology continues innovating at a very fast clip, the ability to slow that pace down by saying, no, this technology actually is not worth it. It holds no social good in this context right now, is so immensely powerful and something worth celebrating.
Yeah, it makes me think of, in general, acts of collective action, of courage, of putting friction in the system, of rejecting the status quo. It makes it possible for other people to do the same. And so I'm just, really curious if you all, are, what are the bright spots that you see, the opportunities for collective action in other sectors, or building on the WGA strike success, or the organizing example around banning facial recognition technology. I just love to hear what you all are, what's inspiring you.
I'll just say that because it's on my mind. One of the things that that we just that Stephen and I think specifically just mentioned was this idea of redlining of what is in your report. I think you call it data minimization, of just like not allowing certain technologies to exist or be deployed against us. And so in the platform in the platform workspace, which is where I do most of my research and what is colloquially called the on-demand or gig economy, there is this sort of novel but not so novel way in which tech companies or these I mean, they're not even tech companies, these labor companies are paying workers so that they are paid by the piece. They're not paid for all the time that they labor. Like your Uber driver is only paid after he's been allocated a ride. And critically, this is something unpredictably like 40 to 60% of the time that they work. And so, Eliza's earlier work showed that this means in a state like California that drivers are making an average of $5.20, I think was the number, maybe $5.70, which is either way about 1/3 of the minimum wage. And so workers over the past, I would say 8 years all over the world have been organizing kind of in silos around the same exact issue. And it's important to remember that these firms are multinational corporations. They have the resources to talk to one another, to deploy the same narratives all over the world, to use the same lobbying techniques, to take best practices and lessons from their own capital campaigns in different places, but workers have had a harder time doing that. So one of the things that's really inspiring me is just last week, a large group of couriers in Brazil really overnight organized a solidarity campaign with Los Deliveristas and the New York Taxi Workers Alliance in New York. This was in the same moment that President Biden and President Lula were meeting to launch a new partnership on workers' rights. And they literally launched overnight this solidarity campaign. And it struck me that they were both being targeted in similar ways. They were both experiencing, all the groups are experiencing precarities and same sorts of precarities, and they immediately understood what one another was talking about, absent sort of language, absent shared language. And it was one of the first times I've seen a kind of international solidarity action happen like that. And it was not just beautiful. I think that it had a huge impact, particularly in Brazil, in terms of how workers in the global South felt supported by their comrades in the center of empire, and sent a message, I think, to the Brazilian state that people and workers in other parts of the world are watching, and their workers are not as isolated and disempowered as they might imagine.
Fantastic example.
Inspiration. I think for me, I'll just speak to something I was doing this week. We just graduated the second year of our what we call a Media Justice Network Fellow, and graduated 12 young people who are all affiliated with different institutions that are connected to a network that we're the host of. And what was, this year's class actually was focused primarily on racialized disinformation. And within the course of the 6 months that they were together, they worked on a project. They worked on individual projects that they received some mentorship around, to kind of just develop a project that is addressing an issue related to disinformation in their community. And and listening to the projects that they came up with, and going through the past few days of spending time with them and getting to know them, it fills me with a ton of hope about what's coming next. This was a class that was predominantly women of color, gender non-binary, and gender non-conforming folks, and predominantly Black, We had two fellows who actually joined us this year from the continent of Africa. Um, and yeah, it was just interesting to be in that space and to see kind of the continuing legacy of building kind of a next generation of leaders. That gives me hope, I think, in the ways that they're thinking about these issues, which far exceed where I was at when I first got involved, however many 15 plus years ago in this work. So, yeah, putting a lot of faith in I think where the next generation is at in terms of contending with these issues and excited to see what comes next.
Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think one place where I have hope that has yet to be realized, you know, for a really long time working on AI issues, AI was sort of this like invisible infrastructure that's used on us for most people. Like there's no tangible point of connection. There's no disclosure often when AI is being used to shape the cost of your mortgage or the quality of your healthcare, or whether you're going to get called in for a job interview. And that in many ways made it very difficult to build like a popular base of understanding and of organizing around AI. And I think that one of the helpful transformations over the last year, there have been many unhelpful ones, but one that's helpful is that, by virtue of there now being like interfaces where people have tangible tactile experiences with AI, it's sort of created a broader base, I think, of public engagement and ability to like talk about the way that AI is directly affecting people. I think people also have direct experiences with the failures of these systems when they turn up things that are like wildly false or wildly offensive. And that I think has created some space for a different kind of public conversation, and one that I think has yet to be realized in policy debates, which have been kind of increasingly narrowly focused on national security and innovation, which are both, historically used as means of avoiding any kind of meaningful accountability and positioning, regulation as either harmful to innovation or as something that was sort of like far off into the distance, as opposed to something that's imminently needed for, ensuring justice for folks in the here and now. But I think that the very fact of this, broader base of public frustration with artificial intelligence, it gives an opportunity to, push back in ways that I think have not yet been realized in many respects, because there's just been so much industry lobbying and so much money sinking into a particular view on these issues. But I think that there's scope for building a real and meaningful alternative vision in this sort of like hype moment that I still do feel optimistic about.
I agree. So for what that's worth, and I'm saying nodding for sure. I have a couple more questions, but do want to tee up the audience. If you have questions for our panelists, we have probably time for one or two towards the end. So feel free to send questions in if you've been holding them. So the last section of the paper builds a roadmap for policy that centers racial equity, and I think critique is not strategy. So we spend the first couple parts of the paper defining the business model and really providing evidence for the ways in which it exacerbates racialized harm. But we do want to land on interventions and solutions. So all three of you, have contributed ideas even in this conversation. But in your paper, Veena, you allude to reimagining a new labor law regime for the digital world. And I would just love to hear, like, highlights of what that would look like, especially from, you really brought some energy around the aspirational world that many of us are longing for, the one where we all really do have what we need to thrive, and that we have I won't get on the soapbox about what it looks like, but what does that look like?
Yes. So I will reiterate what I said a few minutes ago, which is just that in this chicken and egg problem, which is what comes first, organizing or good laws, I will say organizing. I don't think that we're going to get the kinds of new labor laws that we might need to fight some of these inequalities through the beneficence of lawmakers. I think it's clear that we need to be robustly creating our own power structures to force through the kinds of laws that we want to see, and just developing the kinds of worlds that we want to see. That said, I am struck every single day at how successful big tech has been in using the notion of innovation, the notion of technology, to say over and over and over again that the existing employment and labor law regime that we have is outdated. This is, the favorite talking point of the Chamber of Commerce, of the tech companies, that the basic needs that are addressed through the minimum wage, through workers' compensation, through unemployment insurance, through worker health and safety, through the right to organize, that all of these things are somehow obsolete because work is now highly surveilled, digitally surveilled, and sometimes deployed via an app, as opposed to having a boss directly tell someone what to do. And I would just say not only that is complete and utter hogwash, but that technology does give us the opportunity to create more liberatory frameworks for work, right? And so if we were to say that these labor laws and regulations are outdated, they are outdated in the other direction. So technology could give us incredible access to audits on racial and gender pay inequalities in the workforce. It could give us access to better analysis of what kind of really scary things are happening in the workforce with regard to people being injured, maimed, harassed, abused, raped, all of these things. So I'll give you just like a very basic example. Last week, Governor Newsom California Governor Newsom, author of Citizenville, vetoed this very, very important bipartisan supported bill. I think it was AB 316, which was sponsored by the Teamsters, which would have ensured that autonomous vehicles that weighed more than 10,000 pounds had a safety driver in them, and that there was some very, very easy giving of data to the state when the AVs got into accidents or when they were pushed out of their sort of full AV mode. And again, this is bipartisan legislation. This is not radical. This was vetoed, and it's an example of where the approach to labor is very much one of labor degradation, the use of technology for labor degradation instead of uplift. So one of the things I'd really like to see, and I've sort of been on my high horse about this for some time, one of the things that I would really like to see is to use technology to ensure worker flexibility, which is possible, and high worker wages, which is possible, so that workers are paid for all the time that they work when they need to work. And these are things that we can legislate for in a way that maybe wasn't sort of physically possible in the past. But we're not thinking in those terms, I think, because the demands aren't being made.
Right on. And Sarah, how about you? I'm sure you have been celebrating along with a lot of other people the FTC suit against Amazon this week, but and you don't have to go there, but a reinvigorated approach to antitrust is something you've talked a lot about in your work. I don't know if you want to go there, but please jump in with your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that has been, really hopeful that's transpired over the last few years, and there were a lot of folks who were involved in laying the groundwork for this, right? But we're starting to see the transformation of, thinking around antitrust, competition, and sort of the harmful effects of concentrated power in the hands of a few tech firms, both as, becoming contested as common sense. And we're seeing this from the top down. We see this in the White House executive order on competition, which says that the national interest is not served by national monopolies. Like that's a strong signal coming from the top. But we're also seeing it from the ground up that worker organizers and unions are getting involved in antitrust concerns. That antitrust is sort of being seen as a lever for economic justice. That's a deep transformation in what's for a very long time been a very wonky and arcane domain of the law that has been very focused on price sensitivity in particular. And so I think that broader transformation of seeing the harmful effects of corporate power become part of the common sense, and then also tactically seeing meaningful movement towards contesting that concentrated power through a variety of mechanisms, not just through enforcement action, but helpfully, yes, through enforcement action, I think has been really important. And I would read the recent antitrust cases as a key inflection point, but one in a number of series of steps towards using the levers at hand to contest that power. And just like the fact of these cases being filed is history making, but sort of seeing them forward is both going to be a legal battle, but I think also this is shaped too by the court of public opinion and the fact that people can see touch points to direct effects on their lives in these cases. I think is really important. That what we've been hearing from Chair Khan over the last week is that the case, the Amazon case in particular, is at its heart about consumers having to pay more and small businesses getting gouged by a firm that has become a monopoly. Those are things that directly in fact affect all of us, and I think it's helpful, and I think only one in a number of steps that we need to see to really see it through.
Right. And Stephen, you talked a little bit about your focus on carceral technology and how technology is being used in the criminal legal system. And I'm curious if there are any other areas of focus that your constituents are particularly concerned with right now. And I know you've been using some of the frameworks in this report to think through the strategy of your organization. And so I would love to also for you to share that perspective with our audience, for those who are coming from community-based organizing, grassroots contexts, who are interested in leaning in on tech policy issues and are looking to build a bridge in that direction.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess I should say, for starters, we've been going through a strategy process. I don't want to call it strategic planning because that I think evokes certain visions about what the end product should look like, and that's not what we're doing. But we've been going through the strategy process of trying to refresh, our approach. And one of the ways I would say that the report has been immensely helpful is in kind of painting a very clear picture of what the current conditions look like. So from that perspective, it was really helpful in informing ultimately the diagnosis that we generated as part of our process, which which one of the things I guess I would highlight that has been that came as an aha moment for us in this process is that in the scope of our history of how we've approached this work, we realized not just for ourselves but also for the wider field, there was this kind of whack-a-mole thing that was happening where an issue would be popular and it was like the issue of the moment and everybody would move towards it and we got to figure out all the solutions for this thing right now, and then all of a sudden boom, something else pops up and we're moving in a different direction. And certainly for us, like whether it was body worn cameras back in at the height of at the rise of like Black Lives Matter as both an online conversation and offline movement, where there was a conversation around police accountability, the integration of facial recognition in policing, the proliferation and much more visible harm of racialized disinformation, to now this moment that we're living in, the integration of AI models in our society. There's been this tendency to move from one thing to the next, and I think what we've missed, and I think this is something we're trying to course correct for in our strategy, is really trying to focus on the underlying conditions that are creating those issues. Because in the absence of that, what we end up doing is playing a lot of very aggressive defense. And so, in our new strategy, I think one of the things we're moving towards is trying to build a clearer picture about the vision. Like, what's the world that we actually want to live in, and a liberated world, and what's media and technology's role within that world. I've found, and we have found, in just kind of engaging with our members and engaging with other social movements, that clarity about what role do these things play in that future world we're trying to get to, that's not yet quite defined, and that's a contribution that we feel like we can make in this moment. And I think what it'll help us do is make clearer choices now about what we fight for, what we fight against, but more importantly, what we're fighting for. And yeah, so it's less of like, here are the issues that are most concerning to us. But I guess I would say the one kind of feature of the overall system that we're really concerned with is the ways in which big tech have continued to centralize their power through collusion with governments. And that collusion looks different. That collusion comes in the form of like straight up integrating their technologies, embedding them within the functions of government. That's something that in the report goes into a little bit, and making themselves so essential. It is the infrastructure that a lot of our government actually runs on, using Amazon Web Services and using Palantir, but that collusion also looks different in other ways, through the kind of collusion that is more traditional, like lobbying and political contributions. There is a way in which these companies continue to influence government and governance in a way that we have been unable to overcome, or build sufficient enough power to overcome that collusion. So that's a place where we're focusing some attention on, and thinking about campaigns that would weaken that collusion, and that can be at a very hyper local level, but also at a national level. So we're excited to continue finding those opportunities and places where addressing that collusion can also make space for our related social movements to be able to win more.
I'm inclined to let that be the last word. It seems like an excellent place to land for today. Thank you all so much. Thank you to our audience for joining us for this launch, and thank you to our panelists for being with us. And thank you for your work. And I think if there's any takeaway that I have, it's certainly that this work needs all of us coming at it from all of the different angles that we are coming at it. So I really appreciate everyone who's in the virtual Zoom room for your contributions to this effort.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take good care, everybody.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.